The crystal chandelier crashed to the marble floor at exactly 11:47 p.m. I know the exact time because I was staring at the grandfather clock in the corner when it happened, wondering how much longer this nightmare of a night could possibly last. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 champagne flutes shattering at once, followed by screaming from the ballroom. But that's not where this story starts. This story starts 6 hours earlier, when I was kneeling on cold marble with a bucket of soapy water, invisible to everyone who mattered. My name was Elena Cruz. 19 years old. 5'3" in my worn-out sneakers. Brown skin that had seen too much sun from walking everywhere because I couldn't afford gas. Hands that were already rough from 2 years of cleaning other people's messes. I wasn't supposed to be working the Ashworth Davies wedding. I was supposed to be in my dorm room, studying for my economics midterm that was worth 40% of my grade. But Mrs. Peterson from Elite Events had called that afternoon, voice sharp with desperation, "Elena, I need you tonight." Sophia called in sick, and we're short-staffed. Double pay meant $60 instead of $30. $60 meant I could buy groceries and pay for my textbooks this month instead of choosing between them. So there I was, at the most exclusive country club in the city, wearing my black uniform that was too big in some places and too tight in others, carrying a mop bucket through corridors lined with oil paintings that cost more than my mother's annual salary. The Ashworth estate had spared no expense. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a statement. 12,000 white roses flown in from Ecuador. A string quartet that usually played at Carnegie Hall. A 7-tier cake that required its own security guard. The kind of wedding that gets featured in magazines with titles like Society's Most Elegant Affairs. And me? I was the help. The invisible girl who cleaned up spills before anyone important could step in them. The evening had started normally enough. I'd arrived at 4, changed into my uniform in the staff bathroom, and received my assignments from Mrs. Peterson. She was a woman in her 50s who managed events like military operations, complete with a headset and a clipboard that never left her hands. "Elena, you're on perimeter cleaning tonight," she'd said, barely looking at me. "Stay out of the main areas during the ceremony and reception. Clean as you go. If you see a mess, fix it before anyone notices. If anyone asks you anything, smile and say, 'I'll take care of that right away, sir or ma'am.' Questions?" I shook my head. I'd done this dance before. The first few hours were routine. I mopped the service hallways, cleaned the guest bathrooms, and wiped down surfaces that didn't really need wiping. The wedding party was getting ready in the bridal suite on the second floor, and I could hear laughter and music drifting down whenever someone opened the door. At 6:30, I was refilling soap dispensers in the men's room when I heard voices in the hallway. Male voices, confident and loud in the way that comes from never having to worry about being overheard. "Told you this would be a zoo," one was saying. "Victoria's been planning this thing for 2 years. Just glad James is finally settling down," another replied. "Though between you and me, I give it 5 years max." 5? You're generous. I'm thinking 3. Laughter. "She's beautiful, I'll give her that. But she's got a mean streak a mile wide. Remember what she did to that waitress at the Hartley benefit? Made her cry right there in front of everyone." "That's nothing. You should see how she treats the staff at James's place. Goes through housekeepers like tissue paper." More laughter, fading as they walked away. I finished with the soap dispensers and tried to forget what I'd heard. It wasn't my business. Rich people's drama never was. At 7:15, the ceremony began. I watched from the service entrance as 300 guests rose to their feet for the bride's entrance. Even from a distance, she was stunning. Victoria Ashworth, soon to be Davies, seemed to float down the aisle in a dress that probably cost more than I'd make in 2 years. Her veil trailed behind her like silk water, and every eye in the room was fixed on her with the kind of attention usually reserved for movie stars. She looked like a princess from a fairy tale. The kind of woman who'd never had to clean a toilet or count quarters for the bus. The kind of woman I'd never be. The ceremony lasted 45 minutes. I spent it cleaning fingerprints off mirrors and restocking towels, background music to someone else's perfect day. When it ended and the guests moved to the cocktail hour, I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. At 8:30, someone spilled red wine on the marble staircase leading to the ballroom. Mrs. Peterson's voice crackled through the staff radio, "Elena, we need you on the main staircase. Red wine spill. Move fast, cocktail hour's almost over." I grabbed my supplies and hurried toward the front of the building. The staircase was grand, wide marble steps with golden railings, the kind you'd see in movies about rich people's houses. The wine had splattered across 3 steps and was already starting to stain. I got to work immediately, kneeling on the cold marble with my cleaning supplies spread around me. The wine was red, Merlot, maybe, or Cabernet, and it had soaked into the tiny pores of the stone. This wasn't going to be a quick fix. Above me, I could hear the cocktail hour winding down. Laughter, clinking glasses, the kind of conversations that happen when everyone's had just enough champagne to feel sophisticated. Soon they'd be moving into the ballroom for dinner, and this staircase would be packed with people in evening gowns and tuxedos. I scrubbed harder. That's when I heard them coming down the hallway above me. Female voices, high and bright with excitement and alcohol. Absolutely perfect, Victoria. Just perfect. Did you see Caroline's face when you walked down the aisle? I thought she was going to cry from jealousy. She probably was. Her wedding was nothing compared to this. More laughter, getting closer. I kept my head down and kept scrubbing. Almost done. Just a few more seconds and I could get out of the way before. Oh my God, what is that smell? I looked up. She was standing right there. Victoria Ashworth Davies, in all her wedding dress glory, surrounded by 6 bridesmaids in matching lavender gowns. Her veil had been bustled for the reception, but she still looked like something out of a magazine. Perfect makeup, perfect hair, perfect everything. And she was staring directly at me. Is that cleaning solution? She asked, wrinkling her nose. One of the bridesmaids giggled. It totally is. Why are they cleaning now? Can't they wait until after? I started to gather my supplies, ready to get out of their way. Sorry, ma'am. Almost finished. Just give me one more. Wait. The word stopped me cold. Victoria took a step closer, studying me like I was something she'd found stuck to her shoe. Were you watching us? I blinked. Ma'am, just now. When we came down the hall. Were you looking at us? My throat felt dry. I was just cleaning, ma'am. The wine spill, but you looked up. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. Sorry. I'll get out of your way. But she didn't move. If anything, she stepped closer, and suddenly all 6 bridesmaids were looking at me too. I felt like a bug under a microscope. You were looking at my dress, weren't you? The question hung in the air like a trap. I could lie. I could say no, I was just trying to get out of the way, I wasn't looking at anything. But something in her tone told me she already knew the answer. And lying would only make it worse. It's very beautiful, ma'am. The bridesmaids exchanged glances. A couple of them smiled, not nice smiles. It is beautiful, isn't it? Victoria said, running her hands down the silk skirt. Custom Vera Wang. Took 8 months to make. Cost more than most people make in a year. She paused, letting that sink in. I bet you've never seen anything like it up close, have you? No, ma'am. Probably never will again. Another pause. Longer this time. You know what I think, she said, her voice taking on a conversational tone that somehow made everything worse. I think you were imagining yourself in it. My face burned. No, ma'am, I was just. It's okay, she said, cutting me off with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand. It's natural. Girls like you, well, you dream, don't you? You see something beautiful and you imagine what it would feel like to have it. The bridesmaids were all watching now, like this was entertainment. But here's the thing, Victoria continued, her voice still sweet as honey. Some girls get to wear the dress. And some girls. She gestured at me, kneeling there with my bucket and cleaning rags. Some girls get to clean up after the ones who do. The sound that came from the bridesmaids wasn't quite laughter, but it wasn't kind either. Don't feel bad about it, Victoria said, tilting her head like she was talking to a child. Everyone has their place in life. This is yours. She started walking again, her bridesmaids falling into step behind her like lavender-clad soldiers. But she wasn't done. She stopped at the top of the stairs and looked back at me. Oh, and honey, she called out, loud enough that other people in the hallway turned to look. Try not to stare too long at things that aren't meant for you. It's rude. More laughter from the bridesmaids as they disappeared around the corner. I knelt there on the marble floor, cheeks burning, hands shaking as I shoved my cleaning supplies back into the bucket. The wine stain was gone, but I felt like something had stained me instead. Something that wouldn't come out with soap and water. I wanted to cry. God, I wanted to cry so badly. But not here. Not where anyone could see. I finished packing up and headed back toward the service areas, taking the long way around to avoid the main corridors. My shift wasn't over, wouldn't be for another 4 hours, but I needed a minute to compose myself. In the staff bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at myself in the mirror. Same brown eyes. Same dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Same face I'd been looking at for 19 years, but something felt different now. Like Victoria's words had somehow changed how I saw myself. Some girls get to wear the dress. Some girls get to clean up after the ones who do. I thought about my mother, working double shifts at the hospital to pay for my community college classes. I thought about my younger brother Miguel, wearing hand-me-down clothes but never complaining. I thought about the scholarship application I'd filled out last week, full ride to the state university, if I could just keep my grades up and write the perfect essay. I thought about Victoria, born into money, raised with privilege, never having to choose between textbooks and groceries. And I thought about the way she'd looked at me. Like I was nothing. Like I would always be nothing. The door opened and another staff member came in, Sarah, one of the servers. Elena. There you are. Mrs. Peterson's been looking for you. I dried my face quickly. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. She just needs you to handle something in the bridal suite. The bride's mother spilled something on her dress and they need it cleaned ASAP. Of course. More cleaning. More being invisible while rich people live their perfect lives. I'll be right there, I said. Sarah started to leave, then paused. Hey, you okay? You look upset. I forced a smile. Just tired. Long night. She nodded and left. I looked at myself in the mirror one more time. Straightened my shoulders. Took a deep breath. This is not who you are, I told my reflection. This is just what you do. The bridal suite was chaos when I arrived. Victoria's mother, a woman in her 50s who looked like an older, sharper version of her daughter, was standing in her slip while three women fussed over a pale blue gown laid out on the bed. Finally, Mrs. Peterson said when she saw me. Mrs. Ashworth spilled champagne on her dress. Can you get it out? I examined the stain. Champagne was easier than red wine, but this was silk. One wrong move and I could ruin a dress that probably cost thousands. I can try, I said. But silk is delicate. If it's been set too long, just do your best, Mrs. Ashworth said, not looking at me. And quickly. They're about to announce dinner. I got to work, using techniques I'd learned from 2 years of cleaning up other people's mistakes. Blot, don't rub. Work from the outside in. Use cold water, never hot. Around me, the women continued getting ready, talking as if I weren't there. Victoria looked absolutely radiant walking down the aisle, someone said. James couldn't take his eyes off her, Mrs. Ashworth replied. Though I suppose that's to be expected. She's always been stunning. Remember her debut? She was only 16, but she looked like a woman. Had boys lined up around the block. Still does, another woman laughed. Though now it's men with trust funds instead of boys with allowances. More laughter. She knows her worth, Mrs. Ashworth said with satisfaction. Always has. Even as a little girl, she understood that beauty is power, and power needs to be used wisely. I kept working on the stain, trying to block out their words. But I couldn't help thinking about what Victoria had said to me on the stairs. About knowing your place in life. There, I said finally. I think I got it all. Mrs. Ashworth examined the dress critically, holding it up to the light. After what felt like forever, she nodded. Acceptable. Thank you. No please. No you're welcome. Just dismissal. I packed up my supplies and headed for the door. Oh, wait, Mrs. Ashworth called out. Before you go. There's been a small incident in the ladies' restroom near the ballroom. Someone became ill. Can you handle that? My stomach dropped. Someone threw up. I'm afraid so. Quite a mess, from what I'm told. But it needs to be cleaned before the guests notice. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Excellent. Run along now. I left the bridal suite and made my way toward the ballroom, each step feeling heavier than the last. The cocktail hour was ending and guests were beginning to move toward their tables for dinner. I could hear the band starting up, playing something soft and romantic. The ladies' restroom was worse than I'd expected. Someone had definitely been sick, all over the floor, the walls, even somehow on the mirror. The smell hit me the moment I opened the door. I propped the door open for ventilation and got to work. This was my life. This was my place in the world, according to Victoria. Cleaning up other people's messes while they danced and laughed and lived their perfect lives just a few feet away. I could hear the wedding reception getting into full swing. The band playing. Guests laughing. The DJ announcing the first dance between Mr. and Mrs. Davies. Mrs. Davies. Victoria had gotten her fairy tale ending. Her perfect dress, her perfect wedding, her perfect life. And here I was, on my hands and knees, scrubbing vomit off marble floors. It took me 45 minutes to get the bathroom back to pristine condition. When I was done, I sat back on my heels and allowed myself exactly 30 seconds of self-pity. Then I got back to work. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of small tasks. Refilling soap dispensers. Wiping down surfaces. Emptying trash cans. Staying invisible while 300 people celebrated love and happiness and all the things that money could buy. Around 11, I was in the service hallway when I heard raised voices coming from one of the side rooms. Told you this was a mistake. Keep your voice down. Someone will hear. I don't care who hears. This whole thing is a joke, and you know it. I tried to keep walking, but the voices were getting louder. She doesn't love you, James. She loves your bank account. That's enough, Derek, is it? When was the last time she asked how you were feeling? When was the last time she did anything that wasn't about her image or her status or her perfect little life? You're drunk. I'm honest. There's a difference. A door slammed, and I heard footsteps heading in my direction. I ducked into an alcove, not wanting to be seen eavesdropping on what was clearly a private conversation. A man in a tuxedo walked past, mid-30s, tall, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it. He looked upset, distracted. This had to be James Davies, the groom. He paused at the window, loosening his bow tie and staring out at the gardens. From where I was hidden, I could see his reflection in the glass. He looked like a man who just realized he'd made a terrible mistake. After a few minutes, he straightened his tie and walked back toward the ballroom, shoulders set with determination. Playing the part of the happy groom. I emerged from my hiding spot and continued with my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd witnessed something important. Something true, in a night full of beautiful lies. By 11:30, most of the guests were drunk on champagne and dancing to music that cost more per song than I made in a week. I was finishing up in the coat check when Mrs. Peterson found me. Elena, we need you in the ballroom. Someone knocked over a vase near the head table. I nodded and gathered my supplies once more. The ballroom was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over tables dressed in cream and gold. Flowers everywhere, those 12,000 roses, plus orchids and peonies and things I couldn't even name. A dance floor full of people in designer gowns and $1,000 suits. And at the center of it all, Victoria Davies, dancing with her new husband, her wedding dress flowing around her like liquid silk. She looked happy. Radiant. Like the princess she'd always been told she was. I found the broken vase, crystal, of course, shattered near the gift table. As I knelt to clean it up, I could hear conversations from the nearby tables. Beautiful wedding. Victoria outdid herself. Did you see her dress? Absolutely stunning. She's always had exquisite taste. Lucky girl, landing James Davies. His family's been in shipping for generations. Smart girl, you mean? She knew exactly what she wanted and went after it. I worked quickly, picking up the larger pieces of crystal and then sweeping up the smaller shards. The music swelled around me, something classical and romantic that probably had a name I'd never learned. That's when it happened. I was reaching for a piece of crystal under the edge of the tablecloth when someone stepped on my hand. Hard. I cried out before I could stop myself, jerking my hand back and cradling it against my chest. Blood was already welling up from where the stiletto heel had pierced my palm. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't see you there. I looked up, expecting to see a guest who'd had too much champagne. Someone who'd apologize profusely and maybe even help me up. Instead, I saw Victoria. She was standing there in her perfect dress, holding a champagne flute, looking down at me with an expression that wasn't sorry at all. You should be more careful, she said, loud enough for the people at nearby tables to hear. Crawling around on the floor like that. Someone could get hurt. I stared at her, still cradling my bleeding hand. I was cleaning up the broken vase, I said quietly. Were you? She tilted her head, like she was genuinely curious. It looked to me like you were trying to get under the table. Near the gift envelopes. The implication hit me like a slap. No, I said, getting to my feet. I was cleaning. Mrs. Peterson sent me to. Mrs. Peterson. Victoria called out, her voice carrying across the nearby tables. Could you come here for a moment? Several guests were watching now, sensing drama. Mrs. Peterson appeared within seconds, her face tight with professional concern. Is there a problem, Mrs. Davies? I certainly hope not, Victoria said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. But I found this young woman on her hands and knees next to our gift table. Right where all the enveloped gifts are placed. Mrs. Peterson's face went pale. "Elena, what were you doing?" "Cleaning up the broken vase," I said, pointing to my supplies scattered on the floor. "You sent me to clean up the broken vase, did I?" Mrs. Peterson looked confused, stressed. Yes, I remember now. But Elena, you should have been more careful." "Mrs. Davies, I sincerely apologize for any." "It's probably nothing," Victoria said with a wave of her hand. "I'm sure she was just doing her job. But you know how it is with people in her position. Sometimes the temptation can be overwhelming." The words hung in the air like smoke. People in her position. More guests were watching now. I could feel their eyes on me, their whispered conversations. The music was still playing, but it felt like the whole room had gone quiet. "I wasn't stealing," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Of course not," Victoria said, but her tone suggested otherwise. "I'm sure it was all perfectly innocent." She turned to Mrs. Peterson. "Perhaps it would be best if she finished up for the evening. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings." Mrs. Peterson nodded quickly. "Elena, why don't you go ahead and clock out? I'll handle the rest." I wanted to protest. I wanted to explain. I wanted to scream that I was just doing my job, that I'd never stolen anything in my life, that I needed this work more than she could possibly understand. But I could see it in their faces, the guests, Mrs. Peterson, even some of the other staff members who'd appeared to see what the commotion was about. The doubt. The assumption. People in her position. I packed up my supplies with shaking hands, my injured palm leaving small spots of blood on the cleaning rags. The conversations around me were resuming, but I could still feel eyes following me as I made my way toward the service exit. Just before I reached the door, I heard Victoria's laugh, bright and musical, like silver bells. She was back to dancing, back to being the perfect bride, the center of attention. And I was nothing again. Less than nothing. I changed out of my uniform in the staff bathroom, hands still shaking as I pulled on my jeans and the sweater with holes in the elbows that I'd worn to work. The cut on my palm had stopped bleeding, but it throbbed with every heartbeat. In the parking lot, I started the long walk home. For miles through neighborhoods that got progressively less safe as I moved away from the country club's manicured grounds. But this time, something was different. This time, I wasn't just hurt. I wasn't just humiliated. I was angry. Really, truly angry in a way I'd never been before. Not just at Victoria, though she was certainly part of it. But at the whole system. The whole world that said people like her mattered and people like me didn't. That gave her the power to hurt me just because she felt like it, and then walk away without consequences. Some girls get to wear the dress. Some girls get to clean up after the ones who do. Maybe she was right. Maybe that's how the world worked. But maybe it didn't have to stay that way. I walked those 4 miles in the dark, making myself a promise with every step. I was going to matter. I was going to be somebody who couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be stepped on, couldn't be treated like I was invisible. I didn't know how yet. I didn't know when, but I was going to show Victoria Davies and everyone like her that they were wrong about people like me. Dead wrong. By the time I reached my apartment, the anger had crystallized into something harder. Something more dangerous. Determination. I had a scholarship application to finish. An economics midterm to study for. A future to build. And now I had a reason to build it that was bigger than just getting by. I had revenge to plan. Not the petty kind. Not vandalism or gossip or any of the small-minded ways that hurt people sometimes try to hurt back. No, I was going to do something much worse to Victoria Davies. I was going to become everything she never thought I could be. And someday when she least expected it, I was going to remind her of this night. Of the girl she stepped on. The girl she dismissed. The girl she should have left alone. This isn't over, I thought, looking up at the stars barely visible through the city's glow. This is just the beginning. 2 years later, the law library at State University stayed open until 2 a.m., and I was there every single night until closing. Not because I had to be. Because I wanted to be. While other students were at parties or sleeping or living normal college lives, I was in the stacks with my highlighters and coffee-stained notebooks, reading cases until my eyes burned. Constitutional law. Contract law. Tort law. Civil procedure. Every page I turned, every case I memorized, every A+ I earned, it was all fuel for the fire that Victoria Davies had lit inside me that night. The scholarship had come through. Full ride to the State University, plus a small stipend for living expenses. Not enough to live comfortably, but enough to survive if I was careful. If I lived on ramen noodles and generic cereal and didn't buy anything that wasn't absolutely necessary, I moved into the smallest dorm room on campus, a single that was basically a glorified closet with a window. While my hallmates decorated with tapestries and fairy lights, my walls were covered with class schedules, study guides, and a single photo of my family. And in the bottom drawer of my desk, hidden under old assignments, I kept a newspaper clipping from the society pages. Mr. and Mrs. James Davies at some charity gala, him looking uncomfortable in his tuxedo, her radiant in designer everything. I looked at that photo every night before I went to sleep. A reminder of what I was working toward. Freshman year was brutal. I was behind in ways I hadn't even known were possible. My classmates talked casually about things I'd never heard of: spring breaks in Europe, summer internships at their father's law firms, networking events at country clubs I'd never be able to afford to join. They had advantages I couldn't even see, let alone compete with. But I had something they didn't have. I had hunger. While they coasted on connections and family money, I studied like my life depended on it. Because it did. I took 6 classes each semester instead of the recommended 4. I worked in the campus coffee shop 20 hours a week to pay for textbooks and supplies. I joined study groups and law societies and anything else that might give me an edge. And slowly, gradually, I started to climb. Sophomore year, I made Dean's List. Junior year, I was invited to join the Law Review. Senior year, I was editor-in-chief. 4 years of 18-hour days. 4 years of sacrificing everything: social life, sleep, sanity, for the singular goal of becoming someone who mattered. 4 years of remembering Victoria's laugh every time I wanted to quit. Law school was a different beast entirely. Suddenly I was surrounded by people who were just as hungry as I was, just as willing to sacrifice everything for success. The competition was fierce, the workload crushing, the pressure constant. But I thrived. First-year contracts with Professor Morrison, a woman with a reputation for destroying unprepared students. I got an A+. Constitutional law with the legendary Professor Chen, whose class had a 50% failure rate. I finished second in the class. By the end of my first year, other students were asking to study with me. Professors were learning my name. I was becoming someone people noticed. The summer after my second year of law school, I got an internship at Morrison, Klein and Associates. It wasn't the biggest firm in the city, or the most prestigious. But it was respected, and Sarah Morrison, the senior partner, had a reputation as a lawyer who never lost. More importantly, they specialized in high-stakes divorce cases. The kind that involved prenups and hidden assets and bitter custody battles. The kind where wealthy people's perfect lives got dissected in public. The kind where someone like Victoria Davies might someday need a lawyer. I worked that summer like it was my audition for the job I really wanted. I stayed late, came in early, volunteered for the worst assignments. I researched case law until my eyes bled and wrote briefs that were better than some of the associates' work. And when Sarah Morrison offered me a position after graduation, I didn't hesitate. "You're different from the other law students we see," she told me during my final evaluation. Hungrier. More focused. Like you're working towards something specific. She had no idea how right she was. I passed the bar exam on my first try, top 5% in the state. The day I got my results, I called my mother crying. Not because I was surprised, I'd known I would pass, but because it was real now. Official, Elena Cruz, Esquire. I'd done it. The girl who used to clean other people's messes was now a lawyer. But I wasn't done yet. 6 months into my job at Morrison, Klein and Associates, I got the case that would change everything. It was a Monday morning in October. I was in my office, a small space with no windows, but it was mine, reviewing discovery documents for a custody case when Sarah knocked on my door. "Elena, I need to see you in my office." Sarah's office was everything mine wasn't: corner windows, expensive furniture, walls lined with law degrees and photos of her with judges and politicians. The office of someone who'd made it to the top of a profession that didn't make it easy for women to succeed. "I have a new case for you," she said, sliding a thick folder across her desk. High-profile divorce. Lots of money, lots of drama, lots of ways this could go sideways. I opened the folder and started reading. Davies versus Davies. Petitioner, Victoria Ashworth Davies. Respondent, James Michael Davies. My heart stopped. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Could only stare at the names on the legal documents like they were written in a foreign language. "Elena? Are you alright?" I looked up at Sarah, forcing my expression to remain neutral. "Yes, sorry. Just reviewing the details. It's messy," she continued. 3-year marriage, significant assets, allegations of emotional abuse on both sides. She's claiming he was controlling and manipulative. He's claiming she was cruel and calculating. Classic he said she said situation. I turned the page and saw her photo. Victoria looked older. Still beautiful, but there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there at her wedding. Her smile looked more forced, more practiced. Like she'd been wearing it for so long she'd forgotten how to take it off. The husband is claiming emotional abuse? I asked, surprised. According to his preliminary affidavit, yes. Says she systematically isolated him from friends and family, controlled his finances, and was verbally and emotionally abusive throughout their marriage. He's got documentation, text messages, emails, recorded phone calls. I thought about what I'd overheard at the wedding. The groom's friend warning him that Victoria didn't love him, just his bank account. And her side, standard stuff. Says he was the controlling one, that she's the victim, that she deserves half of everything plus alimony because she gave up her career for the marriage. Sarah leaned back in her chair. Thing is, there's no evidence she ever had a career to give up. Woman's never worked a day in her life. I kept reading, absorbing every detail. Financial records showing suspicious transfers. Text message threads showing Victoria's increasing demands for money and gifts. Witness statements from household staff describing her treatment of her husband and others. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A statement from their former housekeeper, describing how Victoria had accused her of stealing and had her fired without cause. How she'd made the woman's life miserable with constant criticism and impossible demands, just like she tried to do to me. So what's our angle? I asked, struggling to keep my voice professional. We're representing the husband. He wants out of the marriage, wants to protect his assets, and wants to make sure she doesn't get more than she's legally entitled to under the prenup. Sarah studied my face. Think you can handle it? Could I handle it? I'd been preparing for this moment for 5 years. Every late night studying, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt I'd pushed through, it had all been leading to this. Absolutely, I said. Good. First hearing is next Monday. Preliminary matters, discovery schedule, that sort of thing. Nothing too dramatic, but it'll give you a chance to size up opposing counsel and see what we're dealing with. I spent the rest of that week preparing like my life depended on it. I read every page of discovery twice. I researched the judge, the Honorable Patricia Hernandez, known for her no-nonsense approach and intolerance for games. I studied Victoria's financial records until I knew them better than she probably did. And every night, I looked at that old newspaper clipping and remembered the girl who'd been dismissed, humiliated, and stepped on. That girl was gone. In her place was someone who understood the law, who knew how to fight, who had the power to make sure people faced consequences for their actions. The morning of the hearing, I put on my best suit. It was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, bought with my first real paycheck. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone confident. Professional. Someone who belonged in a courtroom. Someone who mattered. I arrived at the courthouse early, wanting to get a feel for the space before the hearing began. The building was imposing, marble columns, high ceilings, the kind of architecture designed to remind you that justice was serious business. I found our courtroom and took a seat at the defendant's table, spreading out my files and legal pads. Everything organized, everything ready. That's when she walked in. Victoria Davies looked smaller than I remembered. Still beautiful, still expensively dressed, but there was something diminished about her. She wore a navy blue dress that probably cost more than my rent, and she carried herself like someone who was used to being the most important person in any room. But she wasn't anymore. She took a seat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, Marcus Webb, a man with silver hair and a reputation for getting wealthy wives favorable divorce settlements. They spoke in whispers, Webb occasionally gesturing toward papers spread between them. She didn't look at me. Didn't even seem to notice me sitting across from her. But that was about to change. At exactly 2 p.m., Judge Hernandez entered the courtroom. She was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. I'd read about her extensively. She'd built her career prosecuting white-collar criminals before being appointed to the bench. She had zero patience for lawyers who came unprepared and even less patience for people who tried to manipulate her courtroom. "Good afternoon," she said, settling into her chair behind the bench. "We're here today for preliminary matters in the case of Davies versus Davies. Counsel, please introduce yourselves for the record." Marcus Webb stood first. Marcus Webb representing the petitioner, Victoria Davies, Your Honor. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly, smoothing down my jacket, making sure my voice would be clear and strong. Elena Cruz representing the respondent, James Davies, Your Honor. The words hung in the air for a moment. Then Victoria looked up. For the first time since she'd entered the courtroom, she looked directly at me, and I watched as recognition dawned on her face like a slow-motion explosion. Her mouth fell open slightly. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the way all color drained from her face. Her hands, which had been folded calmly in her lap, began to tremble. She knew exactly who I was. The girl from the wedding. The girl she'd stepped on. The girl she'd humiliated and dismissed and tried to destroy. The girl who was now holding her future in her hands. Judge Hernandez was speaking, outlining the preliminary matters we needed to address, but I could barely hear her over the sound of my own heartbeat. Victoria kept stealing glances at me, whispering frantically to her attorney, who looked confused by her sudden agitation. "Ms. Cruz," Judge Hernandez said, and I snapped back to attention. "Your client is alleging emotional abuse and financial manipulation. These are serious accusations. Are you prepared to present evidence supporting these claims?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Extensive evidence." And I was. Phone recordings where Victoria berated her husband for not buying her expensive enough gifts. Text messages showing her threats to leave him if he didn't give her access to his business accounts. Witness statements from friends and family describing how she'd systematically isolated him from his support system. Financial records showing how she'd spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on designer clothes and jewelry while claiming they needed to economize on his business expenses. Most damning of all, recorded conversations where she explicitly stated that she'd married him for his money and planned to take him for everything she could get. "Ms. Davies," Judge Hernandez said, turning to Victoria, "these are serious allegations against you. How do you respond?" Victoria started to stand, but her legs seemed unsteady. Webb had to help her to her feet. "Your Honor," she began, her voice shaky, "these allegations are completely false. I loved my husband. I supported his career. She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes darting to me again. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," she said, sitting back down heavily. "I need a moment." Judge Hernandez frowned. "Mrs. Davies, are you feeling unwell?" Victoria whispered something to Webb, who looked increasingly confused. He stood up. "Your Honor, my client is feeling overwhelmed by the proceedings. Might we request a brief recess?" 10 minutes, Judge Hernandez said curtly. "But when we reconvene, I expect both parties to be ready to proceed." As soon as the judge left the bench, Victoria was on her feet, moving toward me with urgent, unsteady steps. "You," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you." I looked up from my notes, my expression carefully neutral. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" "Don't," she said, her voice getting stronger. "Don't you dare pretend you don't remember." Marcus Webb appeared at her side, looking alarmed. "Victoria, what's going on? Do you know opposing counsel?" Victoria started, then stopped. How could she explain? How could she tell her expensive lawyer that the woman representing her husband was the same girl she'd humiliated and tried to frame for theft at her wedding? "She's what?" Webb pressed. Victoria stared at me, and I could see her mind racing. Could see her trying to figure out how this was possible, how the invisible girl from that night had ended up here, in this courtroom, holding this power over her life. "Nothing," she said finally. "I thought I was mistaken." But she wasn't mistaken, and we both knew it. When the hearing reconvened, Victoria could barely focus. She kept glancing at me, her confidence visibly shaken. When Judge Hernandez asked her direct questions, she stumbled over her answers. When Webb tried to present their case for alimony and asset division, she contradicted him twice. It was beautiful to watch. By the end of the hearing, Judge Hernandez had granted most of our preliminary motions. Discovery would proceed on an expedited timeline. Victoria would have to provide detailed financial records going back 5 years. Most importantly, the court ordered a psychological evaluation for both parties, something that would likely expose the true nature of Victoria's character. Next hearing is scheduled for December 15th, Judge Hernandez announced. I expect both parties to use the intervening time productively. This case will be decided on evidence, not emotion. Come prepared. As the courtroom emptied, Victoria lingered, clearly wanting to speak to me. But Webb was pulling her toward the exit, probably sensing that whatever was happening between us wouldn't help their case. Just before they reached the door, she broke free and turned back to me. "This isn't over," she said, loud enough for several people to hear. I looked up from packing my briefcase, my expression calm and professional. "You're absolutely right," I said. "It's just beginning." In the hallway outside the courtroom, I was approached by a court reporter who'd been covering the preliminary hearing. "Excuse me, Ms. Cruz. I'm Jennifer Walsh from the Legal Tribune. Could I ask you a few questions about the Davies case?" I paused. This was exactly the kind of publicity that could make or break a young lawyer's career. "I'm afraid I can't comment on ongoing litigation," I said professionally. "But I will say that my client is confident that justice will be served." This is a pretty high-profile case for someone so early in their career. "How did you come to represent Mr. Davies?" I thought about all the ways I could answer that question. I could talk about my qualifications, my experience, my dedication to family law. Instead, I said something that would make headlines. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about who ends up representing whom. But I can promise you this: every client deserves an advocate who will fight for them with everything they have. That's exactly what Mr. Davies is getting. The reporter scribbled notes furiously. "And what would you say to critics who might suggest you're too inexperienced for a case of this magnitude?" I smiled, not the polite, professional smile I'd been wearing all day, but something sharper. "I'd say they're about to learn not to underestimate people based on their assumptions." That evening, I sat in my small apartment with takeout Chinese food and the case files spread across my coffee table. My phone had been ringing all afternoon. Reporters wanting quotes. Other lawyers wanting to know how I'd landed such a high-profile case. Sarah Morrison calling to congratulate me on my performance and remind me that the real work was just beginning. But the call that mattered most came around 9 p.m. "Elena?" The voice was hesitant, uncertain. "Miguel?" "My little brother, now 21 and finishing his own degree in engineering." "I saw the news," he said. "About your case." "Elena, is this the woman from the wedding?" I hadn't told my family the details, but Miguel had always been perceptive. "Yes," I said. "Holy shit," he breathed. "You actually did it. You actually became everything she said you couldn't be." "Language," I said automatically, but I was smiling. "Mom's going to flip when she finds out." "In a good way," he added quickly. "She's been telling everyone about her daughter the lawyer, but this. Elena, this is going to be huge." He was right. The Davies divorce was already attracting media attention, and my involvement would only increase that scrutiny. Every move I made, every argument I presented, every victory or defeat, it would all be public. "Are you ready for this?" Miguel asked. "Because once this really gets going, there's no taking it back." I looked at the newspaper clipping I'd kept all these years, now framed and sitting on my bookshelf. The photo of Mr. and Mrs. James Davies at their charity gala, looking like the perfect wealthy couple. "I've been ready for 5 years," I said. The next morning, I woke up to find my face on the front page of the Legal Tribune. The headline read, "Rising Star Takes on High-Profile Divorce Case." But it was the subheading that made me smile: "Young Attorney Promises Justice Will Be Served in Davies vs. Davies." My phone was already ringing. Interview requests, case consultations, other lawyers wanting to network. The kind of attention that usually took years to build. I ignored them all and went to work. Over the next 6 weeks, I built the case that would destroy Victoria Davies. Not because I wanted revenge, though I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of it, but because justice demanded it. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing her extravagant spending and manipulation of joint accounts. Recorded conversations where she admitted to marrying James for his money. Witness statements from household staff, family members, and friends describing her cruel and controlling behavior. And then there were the psychological evaluations. James's evaluation showed a man suffering from emotional abuse, anxiety, depression, signs of long-term psychological manipulation. Victoria's evaluation was revealing: narcissistic personality traits, lack of empathy, manipulative behavior patterns. The psychologist's report read like a textbook case study in emotional abuse. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. A former employee, a housekeeper who'd worked for the Davies family for 2 years, came forward with recordings she'd made on her phone. Recordings of Victoria screaming at staff, making racist comments, and explicitly discussing her plans to take James for everything he's worth in a potential divorce. The same housekeeper also had photos of bruises she claimed came from Victoria throwing things at her during her violent outbursts. When I met with this woman, Maria Santos, a 50-year-old immigrant with 3 children, I saw myself 5 years ago. Someone just trying to work and survive, being abused by someone with power and privilege. "I was scared to come forward," Maria told me. "But when I saw you were representing Mr. Davies, when I heard what you're trying to do, I had to help." By December, we had a case that was essentially bulletproof. And Victoria knew it. December 15th, the day of the final hearing, arrived gray and cold. I dressed carefully that morning. The same charcoal gray suit I'd worn to the preliminary hearing, but this time with a red blouse underneath. Red for power. Red for victory. Red for the blood I was about to draw. The courtroom was packed. Word had gotten out that this was likely to be the final hearing, and the media attention had drawn spectators, law students, and other attorneys curious to see how it would all play out. Victoria arrived looking like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, her makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her hands shook as she signed documents. James, in contrast, looked like a man who'd finally found peace. He nodded at me as I took my seat, and I could see relief in his eyes. Relief that someone was finally fighting for him. Judge Hernandez called the court to order, and I stood to present our case. For the next 3 hours, I systematically dismantled Victoria Davies. I played the recordings where she admitted to marrying James for his money. I presented financial evidence showing her systematic manipulation of their joint accounts. I called witnesses who testified to her cruel and abusive behavior. I showed photos of the bruises she'd left on household staff. And through it all, Victoria sat there watching her perfect life dissolve in real time. When it came time for her testimony, she could barely speak. Webb tried to salvage what he could, but the evidence was overwhelming. Finally, Judge Hernandez called for closing arguments. Webb went first, making a half-hearted plea for leniency, asking the court to consider Victoria's emotional state and difficult adjustment to married life. Then it was my turn. I stood up, looked directly at Victoria, and began the speech I'd been rehearsing in my head for 5 years. Your Honor, this case is about more than just a divorce. It's about justice. It's about holding people accountable for their actions, regardless of their wealth or social status. I gestured toward the evidence table. The evidence shows that Victoria Davies is not a victim. She is a calculating, manipulative individual who married my client for his money and systematically abused him for 3 years. Victoria's face was white, her hands clenched in her lap. But this case is also about something else. It's about the people who work for families like the Davies family. The housekeepers, the drivers, the staff members who are invisible to people like the defendant until she needs someone to abuse. I pulled out a photo, one of Maria Santos's bruised arms. This is what happens when people like Victoria Davies face no consequences for their actions. When they believe their money and status make them untouchable. I looked directly at Victoria, who was staring at me with something between fear and recognition. Well, Your Honor, some people are not as powerless as they appear. Some people remember. And some people grow up to become lawyers who can make sure that justice is served. The courtroom was dead silent. I asked the court to grant my client the divorce he seeks, to enforce the prenuptial agreement as written, and to award him damages for the emotional abuse he has suffered. I sat down. Judge Hernandez deliberated for exactly 12 minutes. When she returned, her expression was grave. In 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such clear evidence of systematic emotional and financial abuse. The recordings, financial documents, and witness testimony paint a picture of calculated cruelty that has no place in any marriage. Victoria was crying now, quiet tears that ruined her makeup. I hereby grant the divorce as requested. The prenuptial agreement will be enforced as written. Additionally, I am awarding damages to the plaintiff in the amount of $500,000 for emotional distress and abuse. The gavel came down with the sound of justice. In the hallway afterward, as reporters surrounded us and camera flashes went off, Victoria pulled free from her lawyer and approached me one last time. You planned this, she said, her voice raw. All of it. You became a lawyer just to destroy me. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since that night at her wedding. No, I said quietly. I became a lawyer to make sure that people like you face consequences for your actions. I started to walk away, then paused and turned back. You were right about one thing, though, I said, loud enough for the nearby reporters to hear. Some girls do get to wear the dress. I straightened my suit jacket. And some girls grow up to be the ones who take it off you in court. The cameras captured every word. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a bottle of champagne I'd been saving for this moment. My phone was ringing constantly, interview requests, job offers, congratulations from colleagues and classmates. The Davies case had made me famous in legal circles, and the media coverage had turned me into something of a folk hero. But the moment I'd been waiting for came around 9 p.m. A knock at my door. I opened it to find my mother, Miguel, and my younger sister Carmen, all holding flowers and wearing huge smiles. Mija, my mother said, pulling me into a hug. I'm so proud of you. We spent the evening talking and laughing, sharing the champagne and the Chinese takeout I'd ordered. They wanted to hear every detail of the case, every moment of the trial. But the story they really wanted to hear was the one I'd never told them. About the night at the wedding. About the humiliation and the pain and the moment I decided that things were going to change. She had no idea who she was messing with, Miguel said, shaking his head in amazement. She does now, Carmen added. As they prepared to leave, my mother pulled me aside. "Elena," she said, "I want you to know that I would have been proud of you no matter what. But seeing you stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves, seeing you use your success to protect others, that's when I knew we raised you right." After they left, I stood on my balcony looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Victoria Davies was dealing with the consequences of her actions. Learning what it felt like to have someone more powerful decide your fate. And everywhere, there were other girls like I had been. Girls cleaning offices and working minimum wage jobs and being told they didn't matter. I thought about that scared 19-year-old on her hands and knees, cleaning up wine stains while rich people laughed at her dreams. She couldn't have imagined this moment. Couldn't have conceived that the girl they dismissed would someday have the power to bring justice. But she'd held on anyway. She'd kept studying, kept working, kept believing that things could change. And they had. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Morrison. "Elena, the Davies case was brilliant. I'm promoting you to senior associate, effective immediately. We need to talk about your future with the firm." I smiled and typed back, "Thank you. Looking forward to our next case." Because this was just the beginning. There were more Victoria Davies out there. More people who thought their money and status made them untouchable. More victims who needed someone to fight for them. And now I had the power to do exactly that. The girl who used to clean up other people's messes had become the woman who cleaned up other people's lives. Justice, it turned out, had a sense of irony after all. Wow. Did that ending give you goosebumps or what? Elena's transformation from invisible cleaning girl to powerhouse lawyer who took down her tormentor in court was everything. What did you think of Victoria getting what she deserved? And Elena's closing argument in court, did that give you chills? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of ultimate justice and revenge inspired you, smash that subscribe button because we've got more incredible true stories coming your way. Stories that prove your starting point is never your ending point. And share this with someone who needs to hear that no matter how powerless you feel right now, you have the strength to change your entire life. Your circumstances don't define you, your determination does. See you in the next story.